If you drive across Staten Island today, past the quiet residential neighborhoods and long rows of trees, it's hard to imagine that one of the most disturbing institutions in New York history once operated there. You wouldn't guess it by looking at the land now, but from the 1940s through the 1980s, there was a place called Willowbrook State School, a massive institution that families were told would help care for children with developmental disabilities. Instead, the place became a symbol of how badly a system can fail when no one's watching closely enough, and how vulnerable kids can be hurt not only by neglect, but by people in positions of power who believed they were doing something scientific while crossing lines that should never have been crossed. Willowbrook didn't start with the intention of becoming infamous. When it opened, it was presented as a modern facility where children with disabilities could get steady care, access to education, and a structured environment. But almost immediately, the population grew faster than anyone planned for. Rooms built for a handful of kids ended up holding dozens. Staff struggled to keep up with basic tasks like feeding, bathing, and monitoring. Families were promised one thing and then walked into buildings that felt overwhelmed from the moment they passed through the doors. Even in the early years, advocates raised concerns about overcrowding, and by the mid-1950s it was clear the place was under strain. But what made Willowbrook different from other struggling institutions wasn't just the overcrowding. It was the fact that, inside its walls, a group of medical researchers launched a years-long hepatitis study that would later become one of the most controversial research programs in American history. The institution had constant hepatitis outbreaks because sanitation was poor, the buildings were packed, and infections moved easily from child to child. Instead of focusing on fixing those conditions, a physician named Dr. Saul Krugman saw Willowbrook as a place where he could study hepatitis in a controlled way, using the children as test subjects. Krugman believed that if he could understand hepatitis better, he might help the medical world develop more effective prevention methods. To gather that data, he and his team intentionally infected children with the virus between 1956 and 1971, tracking how symptoms developed and how different strains behaved. Some children were given material taken from the stools of infected patients, a method that sounds shocking today but was documented in the medical literature at the time. Others were exposed through different controlled methods. These weren't adults who volunteered for studies, and they weren't patients who understood what was happening. These were disabled children who couldn't meaningfully consent and who depended on the institution for their survival. The question of consent is where the story becomes even more complicated. Families were given forms describing the study as a new preventive program, something that might help protect their children from an illness that was already common at Willowbrook. On paper, there was a consent process, but many parents later said they felt pressured because Willowbrook was so overcrowded that certain buildings, the ones connected to the research program, had better conditions and more staff. To some families, it felt like the only way to get their child into a cleaner, safer environment was to agree to the study. Even though there was paperwork, the power imbalance made true consent almost impossible. And it's important to be precise here. The hepatitis research wasn't illegal under federal law at the time, because the legal protections we expect today simply didn't exist yet. There were no institutional review boards as we know them now. There were no federal standards requiring independent ethical oversight for all human subject research. So Willowbrook became one of those cases where something could be technically allowed while being deeply wrong from a moral and ethical perspective, especially when children with disabilities were involved. While these studies went on, the rest of the institution continued to decline. By the early 1960s, conditions were so bad that staff members and visiting professionals privately told others they were horrified. Children were left unattended in large wards, some unclothed, some sitting or lying on floors that weren't cleaned often enough. Even with the best intentions, the staff simply didn't have the resources to care for the number of kids who lived there. In 1965, Senator Robert F. Kennedy visited Willowbrook unannounced and was appalled. When he left, he publicly described the institution as a snake pit, saying the conditions were an embarrassment to the state of New York. His remarks made headlines, and for a moment it felt like things might change, but Willowbrook remained overcrowded and underfunded. Improvements came slowly, if at all, and behind the better-looking areas shown to official visitors, the deeper problems remained. A year later, in 1966, the broader medical world began waking up to ethical failures across the country. An anesthesiologist named Henry Beecher published a landmark report in the New England Journal of Medicine about unethical human research practices happening in respected institutions nationwide, including the kind of vulnerable patient experiments similar to what was happening at Willowbrook. His article didn't shut Willowbrook down, but it shifted the conversation and made it harder to defend research methods that depended on populations who couldn't consent. By 1972, the truth about the day-to-day living conditions inside Willowbrook exploded into the public eye. A young reporter, Geraldo Rivera, slipped inside with a camera crew and filmed scenes that stunned the entire country. Children living in filth, lying on the floor, crying without attention, covered in their own waste, and wandering crowded rooms without supervision. Rivera's report wasn't focused on the hepatitis experiments, it was focused on the neglect. But once the country saw those images, every part of the institution came under scrutiny. The combination of public outrage, lawsuits from parents, and the growing national concern about how vulnerable people were being treated finally forced major action. In 1975, a federal court approved the Willowbrook Consent Decree, which ordered the state to improve conditions dramatically and eventually move residents into smaller, community-based settings. It became one of the most important disability rights cases in American history, signaling that institutions like Willowbrook couldn't continue operating the way they had for decades. Even after the decree, change didn't come overnight. The institution continued running for several more years as the state slowly transitioned residents into better placements. Willowbrook officially closed in 1987, leaving behind both a physical space that would be reused for other purposes and a legacy that reshaped national policy. What happened there played a major role in forming the environment that eventually led to the National Research Act, the Belmont Report, and the federal rules that created the modern system of institutional review boards. Those reforms weren't only because of Willowbrook, but Willowbrook was a major part of the mosaic that forced America to rethink how it treated people who couldn't protect themselves. For survivors and families, Willowbrook isn't just a policy discussion or a cautionary tale. It's something they carry for life. Some former residents talk about the loneliness and confusion they felt, even if they didn't understand the full scope of the experiments. Others remember the overcrowding and neglect far more vividly than anything involving research. Many families live with the guilt of having trusted a system that didn't protect their children, even though they did what they thought was right at the time. What makes Willowbrook so important to remember is that it wasn't a horror story from a distant country or a secret government program hidden underground. It was a state institution in New York City, operating in the open, with budgets, administrators, medical staff, and paperwork. It existed because the public believed the state was taking care of people who needed help, and because no one looked closely enough when things started to go wrong. If you walk near the old grounds today, there are new buildings, new programs, and no outward sign of the suffering that once took place there. But the lessons remain. Willowbrook showed how easy it is for society to overlook people who don't have a voice, and how far institutions can drift from their mission when oversight and ethics aren't taken seriously. It also showed that sometimes it takes outsiders, journalists, families, lawmakers, and advocates to push the truth into the light when the system refuses to do it on its own. In the end, Willowbrook became one of the most important reasons why modern medical ethics are so strict, why informed consent is taken seriously, and why the country finally recognized that disabled children deserve protection, dignity, and the same human rights as anyone else. The institution is gone, but the people who lived there shaped laws that continue to protect millions today.